Callan stood on the edge of the battlefield, staring at the smoldering wreckage of what had once been the human stronghold. His clothes were torn, his face covered in dirt, but his eyes burned with a quiet determination. The elven forces had swept through their village like a storm, leaving nothing behind but destruction. The rebels who had fought beside him now lay in the dirt, their bodies cold and still. He was the last one standing. The humans had always been treated as less than nothing by the elves. For centuries, they had been ruled by the ancient, proud race that believed themselves to be superior in every way, smarter, stronger, and more magical. The humans, mere ants in their eyes, were forced to serve them. They toiled away in the shadows of the elven cities, living in poverty and fear, their voices silenced by the might of elven magic and steel. Camlin had seen it all, his family torn apart, his friends enslaved, the land they once called home now a shadow of his former self. But today there was something different in the air. There was a shift, a glimmer of hope. Camlin had heard the stories of a powerful artifact, an ancient relic said to hold unimaginable power. It was a weapon capable of changing everything. For the first time in his life, he felt that the humans might have a chance, not just to survive, but to fight back. Camlin glanced over his shoulder at the ruins of their village, where a few rebels, wounded and tired, were slowly regrouping. But there was no time to rest. The elves would return soon, and if they didn't leave now, they would be wiped out for good. It was a moment of desperation, but it also felt like a moment of destiny. A soft, eerie light caught his eye. On the ground, partially buried beneath a pile of rubble, he saw the hilt of something old and beautiful, glowing faintly in the dimming light. His heart skipped a beat. The stories, could this be it? Camlin moved cautiously toward the object, brushing away the stones that had buried it over the years. His hands trembled slightly as he grasped the hilt. The moment his fingers touched the weapon, a surge of power coursed through him. It was as though the earth itself responded to his touch. His entire body shuddered, and his mind briefly went blank. The sword, long lost to time, was now in his hands, and the power within it seemed to recognize him. The glow of the blade intensified, and Callan could feel its magic wrapping around him like a warm embrace. For a fleeting moment, the world seemed to fade away, leaving him alone with the weapon. He had no idea what it was capable of, but he knew it was the key to turning the tide of this war. The elves had long underestimated humans, but with this, he might have a chance to make them regret that mistake. Camlin's gaze sharpened as he turned back toward the remaining rebels, who were beginning to gather. His voice, usually steady but now filled with newfound purpose, rang out, "Gather your weapons. We fight for our freedom today." His words stirred something in the hearts of those around him. Hope, once a faint ember, began to burn brightly in the eyes of the survivors. They had no magic, no grand armies, only their will to survive and the strength of their spirit. But now, with this sword, Callan had something that might just change everything. As the humans prepared to make their last stand, Callan's mind raced. This artifact, whatever it was, had to be more than just a weapon. There had to be a reason it had been hidden away for so long, buried beneath the ruins of a kingdom long forgotten. And now in the hands of a human, it could be the key to bringing down the Elven Empire. But even as the humans rallied, Callan couldn't shake the feeling that this battle was only the beginning. The elves would not be defeated easily. Their pride, their magic, their warriors, they were all far more dangerous than anything the humans had faced before. And yet, Callan could not help but feel a surge of something new, confidence, perhaps, or something deeper, like the fire of an unstoppable storm. The war had begun, and Callan would be the one to lead it. There was no turning back now. The sun dipped low over the horizon, casting long shadows over the camp of the human rebels. Callan stood in the center, the ancient sword in his hand, its gleaming blade flickering in the fading light. He had felt the power of the artifact surge through him when he first touched it, but now, with it in his grip, he began to understand just how much the sword could change things. As the rebels gathered around the campfire, Callan's mind raced. He hadn't asked for this power, but now that it was in his hands, there was no turning back. The sword was unlike anything he had ever seen. The blade hummed with energy, and the air around him seemed to vibrate with an ancient force. It was a weapon forged long before the first Elven kingdoms, a relic of a time when magic was raw and untamed. Now it felt alive, as if it was waiting for him to unlock its true potential. Is it true? Came a voice from behind him. Kalen turned to see Eric, a fellow rebel and a trusted friend, walking toward him. His face was tired, but his eyes were sharp, full of the curiosity that had kept him fighting all these years. It's true, Kalen replied quietly. This sword, it's powerful. It's not just a weapon. It's a key to something much bigger. Eric eyed the sword, his brow furrowing in disbelief. A key? To what? I'm not sure yet, Kalen admitted, his gaze still fixed on the blade. But I think it can give us the strength to fight back against the elves. The power in this sword, it feels like it's been waiting for something, waiting for someone. The others in the camp had started to gather around, drawn by the conversation. Kalen's words sparked something in them. Hope. The kind of hope that had been missing for so long. No one had expected to find such a weapon, and no one knew what it would truly mean. But in a world where the elves were masters and humans were slaves, even the smallest spark of change felt like a victory. Eric was the first to break the silence. What will we do with it? Kalen's grip tightened on the sword's hilt as he thought about the elven forces still marching toward them. We fight. We have to strike before they regroup. We can't let them think we're weak. He could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on him. The elves were relentless. They had magic that could move mountains, armies that could crush entire villages without blinking an eye. But humans had something the elves didn't. The humans had creativity, determination, and the ability to adapt. That was what made them dangerous. Kalen knew that the sword would not be enough on its own. It was a tool, nothing more. It was up to him and his people to use it wisely. Over the next few days, Kalen trained with the sword, learning to harness his power. He discovered that the sword could amplify his strength and speed, but it did not make him invincible. The more he wielded it, the more he realized that it required focus, an understanding of the world around him. It wasn't just a weapon to be swung at enemies. It was something deeper, a force that could shape the very world itself. One evening, as Kalen practiced in the clearing outside the camp, something strange happened. He swung the sword through the air, and for a moment, the blade seemed to vibrate with energy. The air around him shimmered and the ground beneath his feet rumbled. He froze, feeling a pull in the back of his mind, as if the sword was trying to tell him something. Before he could react, Eric appeared behind him, his voice sharp with concern. Kalen, what did you do? Kalen lowered the sword, his breath coming in short gasps. The ground had cracked beneath his feet, and the trees around them swayed as if caught in a sudden gust of wind. The sword's power had responded to his intent, but he wasn't sure what it meant. Had he accidentally unleashed something, or was this just the beginning? I don't know, Kalen said quietly, but I think this sword can do more than we realize. We're only scratching the surface. Eric looked at him, his expression a mix of awe and fear. Then we need to be careful. If the elves catch wind of this, we'll have more than just soldiers to worry about. Kalen nodded, his mind swirling with the possibilities. The elves were clever, and they would never underestimate a weapon like this. But for the first time in his life, Kalen felt a sense of purpose. The humans had always been pushed to the edge, always told they weren't good enough, strong enough, or worthy enough to stand on their own. But now, with the sword in his hand, Kalen knew one thing for certain. The time for the humans to rise had come, and this time, they would not be silenced. The wind blew cold across the camp as Kalen stood at the edge of the clearing, watching the horizon. The sun had barely risen, casting a pale light over the land. The elven army was still several days away, but their presence loomed over the humans like a dark cloud. Kalen knew that time was running out. If they didn't act soon, the elves would crush them without mercy. But Kalen had something the elves didn't, something that could change everything. The sword he held in his hand hummed with power, a constant reminder of the ancient magic it contained. He had barely begun to understand how to use it, but already it felt like part of him. The elves had underestimated the humans for far too long. They believed the humans were weak, scattered, and powerless. But Kalen had seen the spark in the eyes of his people, the same spark that had driven them to fight for their freedom despite the odds. Kalen turned back to the camp, where the rebels were preparing for their next move. The fires from the night before had burned down to embers, and the smell of fresh bread filled the air. The humans might not have the luxury of fine elven feasts, but they had something more valuable: resolve. Eric walked up beside him, his expression serious but hopeful. We can't keep hiding forever, Callan. We need to take the fight to them. If we wait too long, they'll surround us. We'll have no chance. Callan looked at Eric and nodded. I know, but we're not just going to charge in blindly. We need a plan, a way to strike at their heart. Eric's eyes brightened. What do you have in mind? The idea had been brewing in Callan's mind for days. The elves were used to being in control. They had magic, they had numbers, and they believed they were invincible. But what they didn't have was the ability to think like humans. Humans were unpredictable, creative, and quick to adapt. It was time to use that to their advantage. We hit them where it hurts, Callan said, his voice low but full of conviction. We take out their supply lines. They depend on their resources: food, weapons, reinforcements. If we can disrupt that, they'll be forced to fall back and regroup. They won't know what hit them. Eric raised an eyebrow. Disrupt their supply lines? Are we talking sabotage? Exactly, Callan replied. We don't need to face their full force head on. We need to be smart, hit them when they're least expecting it, and then disappear into the forest. If we can make them chase us, it will stretch their resources thin. They won't be able to maintain their advantage. Eric looked around at the rebels, who were starting to gather in small groups, preparing for the day's tasks. It's risky. We'll need every hand we can get. We have them, Callan said. This isn't about fighting their army in a battle. It's about creating chaos. The elves are arrogant, and they don't know how to fight in the way we do. We got to show them that we won't be crushed so easily. A few of the rebels had overheard Callan's plan and were nodding in agreement. There was a spark in their eyes now, a flicker of hope that had been missing before. They were tired of hiding, tired of being afraid. They had fought for so long, but this time, they weren't just fighting to survive. They were fighting to take back their freedom. The plan was simple but dangerous. Callan would lead a small group of rebels to infiltrate one of the elven supply camps. They would set fire to their food stores, destroy their weapons, and sabotage their communication lines. The elves would be forced to deal with the damage, leaving their main army vulnerable. It wouldn't be a decisive victory, but it would be enough to shake the elves' confidence. That evening, as the rebels made their final preparations, Callan took a moment to reflect. For the first time in his life, he felt like they had a chance. The sword, with its mysterious power, had given them a weapon unlike anything the elves had ever seen. But it wasn't just the sword that made him believe they could win. It was the strength of the people around him, their courage, their determination. Callan had no illusions about what lay ahead. The elves would retaliate, and the battle would only get harder from here. But they had already proven something important. The humans weren't just weak creatures to be ruled over. They were capable of standing up for themselves, and with each step they took, with each victory they earned, the humans were growing stronger. As night fell and the camp settled into a quiet rhythm, Callan looked out into the dark woods beyond. The wind had picked up again, and the sound of rustling leaves filled the air. He couldn't help but feel that change was coming. The elves had ruled for too long, and their time was running out. The humans would rise, not as slaves, but as warriors in their own right, and Callan, with the sword in his hand, would lead them into battle. The moon hung high in the sky, casting pale light across the forest. Callan's group of rebels moved silently through the trees, their footsteps barely making a sound on the soft earth. The air was thick with tension, the kind that only comes before an attack. They were deep behind enemy lines, and every shadow seemed to hide a potential danger. But Callan felt something else, something more than fear. It was excitement. They were about to make their first real strike against the elves, and the weight of it felt both heavy and exhilarating. Callan led the small group through the dense underbrush, the sword at his side almost glowing in the darkness. The sword hummed softly, as if aware of the mission ahead. Callan had learned to listen to it, to feel the power it offered. It wasn't just a weapon, it was a symbol, a reminder that the humans had the power to change their fate. As they neared the camp, Callan held up a hand, signaling the group to stop. They crouched low, blending into the shadows. The camp was just ahead, several small tents and a few campfires scattered around, guarded by only a handful of elven soldiers. Callan counted 5 sentries, their figures silhouetted against the glowing embers of the fires. The elves were arrogant, confident in their strength. They never expected a group of humans to slip past them unnoticed. Callan turned to Eric, who was crouched beside him. "You take the left side. I'll go right. Stay low and don't make a sound." Eric nodded, his hand resting on the hilt of his own sword. "Got it." Callan's heart beat faster as he moved, every muscle tense with anticipation. The plan was risky, but the element of surprise was on their side. If they could take down the guards without alerting the rest of the camp, they could set the fires and escape before the elves realized what had happened. Callan crept forward, his steps light as he made his way to the first sentry. The elf was standing with his back turned, staring into the night. Callan raised his sword, its glow soft but steady. He took a deep breath and in one swift motion, he struck. The blade cut through the air with a whisper, and the sentry crumpled to the ground without a sound. He quickly moved to the next guard, his focus unbroken. The elves had always prided themselves on their strength, their magic, but they had never expected the humans to be so swift and quiet. One by one, Callan and Eric took out the sentries, moving like shadows through the night. With the guards down, it was time to set the plan into motion. Callan signaled to the rest of the group, and they rushed forward to the supply tents. The rebels worked quickly, grabbing torches and setting fire to the food stores. The flames spread fast, crackling and lighting up the darkness. The smell of burning wood and dried meat filled the air, and Callan could hear the faint sound of elven voices beginning to stir. "Get ready to move," Callan called out. But before they could finish, a shout echoed from the far side of the camp. One of the elven guards had spotted them. Callan cursed under his breath, his hand tightening around the sword. They had to move, and fast. "Fall back," he yelled, and the rebels scattered into the trees, disappearing into the shadows. Callan stayed behind for a moment, watching the camp burn. The elves were already scrambling, their voices growing louder as they realized what had happened. The humans had struck, and they had done it in a way the elves never expected. As Callan turned to flee, he heard the unmistakable sound of hooves in the distance. Elven reinforcements were on the way. They had to get out of there before the elves realized the full extent of the damage. Callan ran, his heart pounding in his chest, his mind focused on nothing but escape. The sword felt heavy now, not from the weight of the blade, but from the responsibility it carried. The humans had just dealt a blow to the elves, and they would need to strike again. But for now, survival was the priority. The rebels reached the edge of the forest, and Callan could hear the elves shouting in pursuit. But they were too late. The humans had already melted into the trees, leaving only the smoke and flames behind. The first strike was a success. As they caught their breath and gathered their wounded, Callan couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. It was just a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. They had done what no one thought they could. The elves had been caught off guard, and the humans had proven they were more than just pawns in the elven game. Callan looked at his people, tired, but filled with a new sense of purpose. This was just the beginning. The humans would rise, the elves would fall, and Callan would lead them to victory, one step at a time. "You said." The days following their first strike were filled with both hope and uncertainty. Callan and his rebels had returned to their hidden camp deep in the forest, their hearts lifted by their small victory. The elves, however, were not fools. Callan knew they would not take the sabotage lightly. The elves had always been quick to retaliate, and their pride would not allow them to let such an attack go unanswered. Callan sat by a campfire late one night, the embers glowing brightly in the quiet darkness. His hand rested on the sword, the blade still pulsing with an energy that he couldn't fully understand. He had felt its power before, but now, more than ever, he wondered what it could truly do. The elves would come for them, and he needed to be ready for whatever they might throw at him. Eric joined him by the fire, his expression grim. "We've made them angry, Callan. The elves will send their best after us. We have to prepare for a fight we can't avoid." Callan nodded, his gaze fixed on the flames. "I know, but this is just the beginning. The elves are used to having control. Now they'll see that they're not untouchable. We've taken the first step. Now we need to be ready for the next. In the distance, the sound of hooves reached Callan's ears. He tensed, but Eric raised a hand, signaling for him to stay calm. Scouts, Eric whispered. They've been patrolling the edges of the forest. We need to be careful. The next morning, as the first light of dawn filtered through the trees, Callan gathered his people. The atmosphere was tense, but there was an unmistakable sense of determination in the air. The rebellion had already proven that they could strike back, and now they would prepare for the Elven retaliation. We need to spread out, Callan said, his voice steady. If we stay in one place too long, they'll find us. We'll divide into smaller groups and move deeper into the forest. Keep the fires low and the noise down. We don't want them to track us too easily. Eric stepped forward, a map of the forest in his hands. We know the elves have set up patrols on the northern and western borders. I suggest we head south for a few days. It's a risk, but it might throw them off our trail. Callan looked at the map, his fingers tracing the lines of the forest. The south was dense with trees, harder to navigate, but it offered better cover. Agreed, we'll head south. Keep moving at night, rest during the day. The more we can keep off their radar, the better. The group broke camp quickly, packing up their supplies and preparing to move. Callan took one last look at the clearing where their camp had been, feeling a sense of both loss and resolve. They had left their homes behind, but they were fighting for something far more important now, their freedom. As they made their way through the trees, Callan couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The forest was quiet, too quiet. Even the birds had stopped singing. Callan motioned for the group to slow down, his senses on high alert. He could hear the faint sound of footsteps in the distance, too light, too quick to be human. Get ready, Callan whispered, drawing the sword from its sheath. The blade felt familiar now, almost like an extension of his arm. He didn't fully understand its power, but it gave him a sense of confidence he had never known before. Whatever the elves threw at them, he would be ready. The rebels spread out, taking cover behind trees and rocks. Callan could hear the rustling of leaves, the snap of twigs as something approached. He motioned for everyone to be silent, and for a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. And then the first elven scout appeared. It was a lone figure, moving gracefully through the trees, his eyes scanning the area. Callan's heart pounded in his chest. The elven scouts were known for their keen senses, and this one was no different. He would spot the rebels if they weren't careful. Callan signaled to Eric, who nodded and moved silently to the scout's left. The plan was simple: take him out quickly before he could alert the main force. Callan stepped forward, his sword raised, but just as he was about to strike, the scout turned and looked directly at him. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. Callan's heart skipped a beat. Had he been spotted? But then the scout didn't move, didn't make a sound. Instead, he looked at Callan for what felt like an eternity, his expression unreadable. Then, without warning, the scout vanished into the forest, leaving only the rustling of leaves behind. Callan stood still for a moment, his mind racing. Had he imagined it? Was the scout toying with them, or was something else at play? Whatever it was, Callan knew one thing for certain. The elves were watching, and their next move would be even more dangerous. The real fight was only just beginning. The forest had grown eerily quiet in the days after their close encounter with the elven scout. Callan's heart still raced at the memory of the moment when he thought he had been discovered, but the elves hadn't pursued them. Instead, they had gone silent. It was as if the forest itself held its breath, waiting for the next move. The stillness was unnerving. Callan had been through enough battles to know that a lack of action was often more dangerous than a direct attack. He couldn't shake the feeling that the elves were setting a trap. They had moved deeper into the forest, following the southern path as planned. The trees grew thicker, their branches twisting above to block out much of the light. The air was cool, but there was a heaviness to it. Callan knew that the elves were out there somewhere. He could feel their presence, like a shadow lingering just beyond the edge of his vision. As they walked, the rebels whispered to each other, their voices low and cautious. They had been on the move for days, and tensions were starting to rise. Supplies were running low, and the constant travel was wearing them down. But Callan pushed forward, keeping his eyes sharp. They couldn't afford to stop now, not when they were so close to breaking free. Stay alert, Kellen said, his voice firm. We don't know where they are, but they know where we are. Eric nodded, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. We've got to keep moving, Kellen. If we stay still too long, they'll catch us. Kellen agreed. They needed to keep moving, but at the same time, they couldn't afford to rush blindly into danger. Every step had to be calculated, every movement measured. If the elves were watching, they would be waiting for any mistake, and Kellen wasn't going to give them the chance. As night fell, the rebels set up camp in a small clearing. Kellen instructed everyone to stay close, making sure the fire was small and the smoke barely rose. It was a calculated risk. The fire would keep them warm and provide some light, but it also made them a target. Kellen's senses were heightened, listening for any signs of movement, any sounds that would give away the elven presence. The hours passed slowly, and the darkness seemed to grow thicker around them. Kellen's mind raced, his thoughts swirling with the possibilities of what the elves might do next. What kind of trap were they setting? Was it possible that they had already planned for the humans to make this move? He couldn't let his guard down, not for a second. Suddenly, a faint sound broke the silence, a rustle in the underbrush, followed by the soft crack of a twig. Kellen froze, his hand reaching for his sword. The rebels tensed, each one waiting for the signal to move. Kellen nodded to Eric, who immediately slipped into the trees, his steps silent as a shadow. They had barely moved when another sound came, this time closer, a whisper of movement that didn't belong to any of their group. Kellen's heart skipped a beat. They had been found. Without warning, the ground beneath them shook. A loud thud followed by a series of strange, rapid noises echoed through the forest. Before Kellen could react, he heard a familiar voice from the darkness. Ambush! The elves had set a trap. Kellen's mind raced as he quickly looked around. The rebels had no time to prepare, no time to react. From every direction, figures appeared from the shadows, elven soldiers armed and ready. Their movement was swift and fluid, almost unnatural in their precision. Kellen's pulse quickened. The elves had planned this too well. They had been leading them into this clearing all along, carefully guiding them into the perfect position. It was a strategy Kellen hadn't seen coming. Fight back, Kellen shouted, drawing his sword and raising it high. Defend the camp. Eric, Kellen shouted. We need to break their lines now. Eric nodded, his eyes focused. On your signal. Kellen hesitated for only a moment. The elves were closing in, and there was no time to waste. He needed to take the fight to them, break their formation before they were overwhelmed. With a fierce yell, Kellen lunged forward, pushing through the line of elven soldiers. Eric and the rest of the rebels followed, attacking with the desperation of those who had nothing left to lose. The forest echoed with the sounds of battle as the fight raged on. Kellen's mind was a blur of movement and chaos, but through it all, one thing was clear. They weren't going down without a fight. They would survive. They had to. The forest was alive with the sounds of battle. Kellen's sword swung with precision, clashing against the blades of the elven soldiers. But the elves were everywhere, their numbers overwhelming. The rebels fought fiercely, but it was clear they couldn't keep up with the relentless pressure. Kellen's heart raced as he scanned the battlefield, looking for a way out. Fall back, Kellen shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. Retreat to the trees. It was their only chance. If they didn't move now, they would be trapped in the clearing, surrounded by the elves. Kellen turned to Eric, who was holding off 2 elven warriors at once. Get to the trees. Kellen called again. We need to regroup. Eric nodded, his face set in determination, but the elves were closing in. Kellen saw one of the rebels fall, his body crumpling to the ground under the weight of an elven strike. His stomach twisted with the sight, but there was no time to mourn. They couldn't afford to lose more. With a shout, Kellen charged forward, cutting through the elven line with a single powerful swing. The elves hesitated for a moment, surprised by the ferocity of the attack, and Kellen used that brief opening to push his way to the edge of the clearing. The others followed, retreating into the cover of the trees, their breaths heavy with exertion. Keep moving, Kellen urged, his voice urgent. We can't stay here. The rebels scrambled through the dense undergrowth, moving as fast as they could, but the elves were close behind. Canlin could hear the swift steps of their pursuers, their voices sharp and commanding. The elves were not far off, and their magic would give them the advantage in the pursuit. Canlin's mind raced. They had to find a way to shake the elves. They couldn't outrun them, not in this terrain. They needed a plan. As he ran, he searched the forest around them, looking for any way to gain the upper hand. His eyes fell on a steep hill in the distance, a narrow path that led to higher ground. If they could make it there, they might be able to use the terrain to their advantage and turn the tables. Head for the hill. Kalen yelled to the others. Move. Without hesitation, the rebels changed direction, pushing toward the hill. The ground was uneven, the trees thicker here, but it was their best chance. The elves would have to navigate the steep terrain as well, and if they could get to the top, they might have the high ground they needed to hold off their pursuers. But the elves weren't far behind. Kalen could hear them getting closer, their voices growing louder. He could feel the heat of their magic as it crackled through the air, the pressure building. They were using their magic to push the rebels into a corner, trying to force them back down into the open. Don't stop, Kalen shouted, his voice breaking through the panic. We can do this. The rebels pushed on, their determination unwavering. They were exhausted, their bodies sore from days of travel and battle, but they had come too far to give up now. They reached the foot of the hill, and Kalen quickly scanned the surroundings, looking for a way to use the terrain to their advantage. A thick cluster of trees grew near the top, their branches intertwining to form a natural barricade. It wasn't much, but it would provide some cover. Form up, Kalen commanded. Take cover in the trees. We'll hold them off here. The rebels quickly gathered, hiding behind the trees and rocks, their weapons ready. Kalen stood at the front, his hand gripping the sword tightly. His mind was focused, sharp. The elves would come soon, and they needed to be ready. Kalen glanced around, his heart still racing. The rebels had held their own, but they couldn't afford to stay in one place for too long. The elves would regroup and come back stronger. They needed to move again, to find another place to rest and plan their next move. But for now, they had bought themselves some time. They had escaped the elves' trap. Let's go, Kalen said, his voice low but filled with determination. We move out at first light. We're not done yet. The rebels had moved quickly through the night, barely stopping to rest. The forest seemed to stretch endlessly in all directions, and the further they went, the more isolated they felt. Kalen's mind was focused, but exhaustion weighed heavily on him. They had survived the ambush, but he knew that the elves would not give up so easily. This fight wasn't over. It was only getting started. As dawn broke, the rebels reached a clearing at the edge of the forest. It was a perfect spot, open enough to allow them to see any approaching enemies, but surrounded by dense trees on all sides. They would have a few hours to prepare before the elves caught up to them. We rest here, Kalen ordered, his voice firm but tired. Take the time to catch your breath. We'll need it. The rebels set up camp quickly, their movements mechanical after days of constant travel. Kalen kept his eyes on the horizon, knowing the elves would be close by. They had to be. The elves weren't the kind to let their prey escape. Eric approached Kalen as the others settled down. Do you think we'll make it? He asked quietly, his voice laced with concern. Kalen didn't look at him immediately, his eyes scanning the trees. We have to make it. We've come too far to turn back now. The first sound Kalen heard was the distant thudding of hooves. The elves were on horseback, closing in fast. The rebel group tensed, readying their weapons. Kalen's heart pounded in his chest, but his hands were steady. They had come too far to fall now. Form up, Kalen ordered, positioning himself at the front of the group. We fight together. Stay focused. The elven cavalry emerged from the trees, their silver armor gleaming in the weak morning light. The rebels had no cavalry of their own, but they were fighting for their homes, their freedom. And that made them stronger than any army. The elves didn't hesitate. They charged forward, their swords raised, their battle cries echoing through the trees. Kalen's breath quickened as he drew his own sword, feeling the weight of it in his hand. The time had come. The rebels met the elves head-on, the clash of metal ringing through the air. Kalen swung his sword, his movements fueled by pure willpower. He could hear the shouts of his comrades, the crackle of elven magic, the rhythmic pounding of hooves. Everything moved in a blur. He had no time to think, only to act. Eric fought beside him, his sword flashing as he parried an elven blow. "Keep going," Kalen shouted, his voice rising above the noise of battle. "We can win this." The elves were relentless, but the rebels had something they didn't: determination. The rebels fought with everything they had, not just to survive, but to make a stand. Kalen could see the fear in the eyes of the elven soldiers as they realized this fight wasn't going to be as easy as they thought. They weren't dealing with helpless humans anymore. They were dealing with a people who had been pushed to their limits and had nothing left to lose. Kalen's sword cut through the air, striking one of the elven riders. The soldier fell from his horse, but Kalen didn't have time to watch him hit the ground. He was already moving, his focus entirely on the next enemy in front of him. The battle was fluid, shifting from one moment to the next. It was a battle of endurance now. Who would outlast the other? The elves began to slow, their formation breaking apart as the rebels pushed forward. Kalen could see the hesitation in their eyes, the doubt creeping into their ranks. It was small, but it was enough. The tide was turning. "We're almost there," Kalen shouted, urging his people onward. With one final push, the rebels managed to force the elves back. The elven cavalry, once so sure of their victory, was now in retreat. The remaining soldiers pulled back into the trees, unwilling to fight any longer. Kalen watched them disappear into the forest, the adrenaline still coursing through his veins. The battle was won. But Kalen knew this wasn't the end. The elves would regroup, and they would come again. This fight would never truly be over until they had their freedom. As the rebels caught their breath, Kalen turned to face them, his expression hard but proud. "We've done it, but we can't stop here. We have to keep moving. We have to keep fighting." The rebels nodded, their eyes filled with determination. They had faced the elven army and won. Now they had to finish what they started. There was no turning back. "We'll fight until the last," Kalen whispered to himself, knowing that the war for their freedom was far from over.